This is Top of Mind, the Dr. Patrick Slowinski Show.
Welcome back to Top of Mind. We're moving full speed ahead, and it's been an incredible season so far. We've had the privilege of hosting some truly remarkable guests lately, and today's episode is no exception. This one is going to be really special, and with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Slavinsky to introduce our today's guest.
Thank you, Victor. And my guest today is Matthew Hurtt. And some of you might have seen him on television, being the Republican apologist in Northern Virginia. And just to getting the word out there that conservatives do exist in a traditionally blue state the last few years, that we're trying to turn purple, if not red. And so Matthew's going to talk to us about that. He's also done some amazing work at the Leadership Institute. That's something that a lot of people don't know about outside of this area, but the people who are here do know the work that Matthew's done on getting younger conservatives active, getting the word out, and some of us old guys too. So Matthew, we're happy for that. Matthew has more than 15 years of experience in fundraising, organizing, and public speaking. He has trained tens of thousands of activists, conservative activists across the country and around the world. And in his personal capacity, as I've already mentioned, he serves as the chairman of the Arlington County Republican Committee and has been involved in local, state, and national Republican politics since he ran for local office himself at the age of 19. You can do that? You just had to be 18 in 2006 in the Commonwealth. So Matthew, welcome to Top of Mind. And I want to get you started with clearly what's top of mind for a lot of people, President Trump's second term. We've got a lot of different opinions on his efficacy. The last Rasmussen polls were very good for him. So I wanted to kind of hear from you, what you're hearing on the ground from your contacts, Republicans and maybe independents or libertarians or otherwise. And are those Rasmussen polls reflective of what people really think about what President Trump is doing? Because you go from either a dichotomy of chaos, the whole place is falling apart, it's a nightmare, to this is the best administration we've had in decades. So where are we?
And thank you so much for having me on. I live in Northern Virginia, and so we've got a little bit of a skewed electorate up here, disproportionate number of federal employees or those who benefit from the contract culture. But when it comes to immigration, when it comes to public safety, those two issues are linked very closely together. A lot of Americans are on board with the president's policies. When it comes to sort of radical gender ideology in education, a lot of Americans are on board with those policies. There is a difference between the policies as they exist and in execution. And so there is some chaotic execution of these policies, but something that President Trump has done really well, that even better than the first term, is getting the right people into the right places. So this administration hit the ground running in November after the election with its staffing efforts. Some of those efforts I assist with in my professional capacity, and then just by being so close to Washington, D.C., the partisan activity is complementary as well. So there's some good things. There are some things as a small L libertarian Republican. I was a Ron Paul delegate in 2012 in the Republican National Convention in Tampa. So tariffs, I'm not particularly excited about. I understand the nature of them as a bargaining chip, but we've seen a little bit of tumult in the economy. I think part of that is driven by uncertainty in tariffs, but certainly a lot of the domestic policy many Americans are supportive of, and it seems the president is putting together a good team to execute on many of those policies.
Let's go back to immigration because if I were to put my finger on the pulse of people that have any in Northern Virginia, where our listeners should know if they don't know already, is 95 or more percent liberal at least. On immigration, a lot of them still think that something has to be done. Do you think President Trump is doing it? And are we feeling any of that here in the Commonwealth?
Well, immigration is tied directly to public safety in many communities, particularly in Fairfax and Arlington counties, where the Commonwealth's attorney or the prosecutor in most other parts of the country refuses to prosecute many low-level and even crimes against individuals. So we've seen an increase in property crime, an increase in crimes against individuals, violent crime. And some of that is being perpetuated by people who should not have been in the country to begin with. There have just been in the last several weeks 3 or 4 stories in both Fairfax and Arlington where somebody who has an illegal status, they've overstayed their visa or some other status, who's committed some crime. And crime is where the rubber meets the road for most people. And then in Fairfax and Arlington, the prosecutors aren't dutifully prosecuting those crimes. And in addition to that, the elected officials, particularly here in Arlington, where I live, they aren't allowing local law enforcement to even work with federal immigration and other law enforcement agencies. So we're seeing an effort to resist this administration from an all-Democrat county board in Arlington and mostly Democrats in Fairfax. And where those play out at the policy level, where the rubber meets the road, is an increasing crime and really harmful policies to the immigrant communities. And there are large immigrant communities in Northern Virginia, Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans who live in neighborhoods that are less safe because local elected officials refuse to allow that collaboration between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement agents.
So explain to our listeners then, Virginia is not a sanctuary state or commonwealth. So how's Arlington and other counties around the DMV, the District, Maryland, and Virginia, how are they allowed to get away with this? How's that happen?
Well, a number of years ago, the Arlington County Board, 5 members, all Democrats, passed a memorandum of trust between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement agents, which allowed for Arlington County Police to interact with federal law enforcement. And they would do this on a number of issues. If it's crimes related to immigration, if it is capital murder, like violent crimes, things like that, you would see local law enforcement in any part of the Commonwealth or the country interact with FBI, Immigration Customs Enforcement, any of those federal agencies. And just recently, in the last couple of weeks, Arlington County has updated that memorandum of trust, which prevents Arlington County Police from calling ICE. And what we've seen, the statistics, the data actually prove this out. Arlington County Police had coordinated and collaborated with ICE more times in the first 3 months of this year alone than they did in all of last year. So we are seeing, we've seen border crossings slow to a trickle, but the individuals who are still here, anybody who would flout the law to be present in the country is likely engaged and can be engaged in other criminal activity. And so we're seeing that play out in the community. There was a gentleman who stabbed his girlfriend and their young child late last year in Pentagon City. I still haven't been able to identify the immigration status of that gentleman. His girlfriend died. This was a domestic dispute. Ultimately, girlfriend died. The toddler daughter survived, and there are questions surrounding this individual's immigration status. There are a number of others, individuals in Fairfax who have been arrested 2 or 3 or 4 times, who should not even be in this country at all. So we've got in Northern Virginia, we've seen an increase in more violent or dangerous crimes, and there is a direct correlation to immigration. And the county board is permitted to update its, rules of engagement when it comes to interacting with federal law enforcement. But you would never see this. You would never see a local governing body of any partisan makeup refuse to work with the FBI if there was a serial killer, or refuse to work with the ATF if there was a school shooter. You never see any of those instances. But in a place like Northern Virginia, where the elected officials feel they have to resist, they are resisting President Trump's policies, even if they are good policies.
No, understood. And for someone who lives here with you, who's a neighbor of yours, it is kind of frustrating. But why, even though people acknowledge that there are issues, why do they keep going back to the Democrats every single election cycle? I mean, you and I are out there with sample ballots getting harassed. We're gonna hit that in a second. But what is it that is it just tradition? Is it groupthink? Is it habit? Why are people still so eager to vote for Democrats despite all the issues?
There's this concept called the Great Sort, which has happened over the last 40 or 50 years, where people have more or less assembled in communities that are reflective of their political ideology. And so you look at a place like Williamson County, Tennessee, or Rutherford County, Tennessee, where I'm from, and those communities are overwhelmingly Republican or conservative. In Northern Virginia, the growth of the federal government and the combination of the growth and the Great Sort has populated Arlington in particular. 81% of Arlington voters voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Now, 79% of Arlington voters voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. And we'll talk about efforts on the ground later in this episode. But people, it's hard to break that habit. And when you drill down even further in a place like Arlington or a place like Fairfax, there may be 160,000 active voters in Arlington, but only about 6,000 of them are actually nominating Democrats in a nominating contest in the summer. And so you end up getting the most radical Democrat, somebody like a Takis Karantonis, who's up for re-election this year, who has just the most far left views of any possible candidate. And so these communities produce far left candidates, and those Democratic primaries tend to be, we say the Democratic primary tends to be the general election, and without strong opposition on the ground from any other political party or political entity, that person coasts to election in November. And so, we've got a June primary. The most far left Democrat will win that primary, and then he or she will get elected in November.
I wanted to turn to you because you mentioned to me that you've been heavily involved in our election season here. We've got primary elections up in June this month. I'm a election worker, so I always do my part for a day. You also have spent some time on the campaign with the lieutenant governor. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the Capitol and what you're hearing about the race coming up? Are we going to have another Republican governor? How's that going?
Well, traditionally in Virginia, the party that holds the White House, so in this case, the Republican Party, Donald Trump, has trouble holding the statewide election in Virginia. So we have a governor, a lieutenant governor, and an attorney general who are elected not on a slate, but they tend to run together. And Glenn Youngkin and Winsome Sears and Jason Miyares won the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general race in 2021, sort of a reaction to Joe Biden. And on that campaign trail, Joe Biden came into Virginia 2 times, and he came to Arlington, and the energy was low. People were not excited. Democrats were not excited about Joe Biden coming to stump for the candidates. And we saw that as Republicans in Arlington. This year, however, Donald Trump won the election, the national election, even though he didn't carry Virginia. So this is it is often a reactionary response to the national elections. In Virginia, the Republicans don't have a primary for the statewide elected offices. There was a primary, but a candidate dropped out in the lieutenant governor's race, leaving just one candidate. And through the 3 candidates, Winsome Earl Sears for governor, a guy named John Reed, who was a talk show host in Richmond for a long time, worked in the post-Reagan, post-White House office of Ronald Reagan, and also for a number of senators and elected Republicans in Virginia, John Reed. And then Jason Miyares, who is the sitting attorney general, is running once again. And what I'm seeing on the ground is, in 2021, we had all 3 of our statewide candidates ran together. There seems to be some hesitance to run together this time around. That's a little bit concerning. The ticket should be united. I think John Reed is doing an excellent job talking about all 3 campaigns and all 3 races and what it means for Virginia. And I'm seeing a little more energy at the lieutenant governor level. Again, the candidate is John Reed. There was a bit of a scandal as his opponent dropped out of the primary, and a lot of grassroots, the people who actually make elections work, the people who get out and knock on doors and volunteer and show up on election day, and who volunteer to pass out sample ballots. There's a lot of energy behind John Reed. Just earlier today, I attended an event for the lieutenant governor, Winsome Earl Sears, who's running for governor, and I just didn't see the energy. It was in Fairfax. We don't win a lot of elections as Republicans up here, but there are a lot of people up here. And it seemed to be a low energy event. As chairman of a committee, it's my responsibility to drive up the energy. And so in Arlington, I can tell you, everything that I push out to my members is an effort to get involved, to drive a narrative, to connect the state level issues or the national issues to the local issues, and to keep people enthused all the way through November. We don't have a primary. The Democrats have a primary. And so I have to find ways to energize Republican voters all the way through November.
Yeah, people were asking me, why are you involved if it's only a Democratic primary? Because I like civics. I like to be a part of it. And I think if more of us would just be part of the civics process, we'd learn a lot more. I wanted to talk to you a little bit, as we're still talking about the great Commonwealth of Virginia. Back in 2016, when President won the first term, he had a really close race with Hillary Clinton, a lot closer than people had expected. And then, things tapered off in 2020. And then, of course, he did not get over the line with 2024 against Kamala Harris. So a lot of people that live in Virginia, especially in Southern Virginia or across the state, except for where you and I are in the northern part, they have these dreams about a red Virginia again, especially our older voters that remember a red Virginia. I know you've done a lot of work in groundwork looking at how we could do that. So why don't you just give our listeners an update on is the Commonwealth ever going to be at least purple, or could it ever be red again?
I think Virginia can be competitive and can be red. What does it take to do that? And I can really only speak for what I do in Arlington and offer and hope that other committee chairmen do this. First of all, and many people don't realize that a committee chairman gets paid absolutely nothing. And it is a full-time volunteer position.
It's a labor of love for you, Matt.
And it's so much fun because, I moved from a red county. I ran for local office when I was 19 outside Nashville, Tennessee, and Republicans dominate that county. And I moved to Arlington, where I jokingly say there's nowhere to go but up for Republicans or for conservatives.
That's true.
And there were chairmen before me who were, if you remember Lord of the Rings, I kind of liken these kinds of chairmen to the steward. So a guy or a gal who just oversees a slow decline, because there's a psychology to it. There is people feel like, well, there's no point in running candidates because we're not going to win anyway. And if we're not going to win, we can't run candidates. And good candidates don't run because then their neighbors realize they're Republican and they have to deal with that. And so you get into this cycle of a constantly dwindling committee. And I became chairman in March of 2023. My predecessor, she had to move back to her home state. And I'd really held off being chairman for a long time because I knew how much work it was. And so finally I said, okay, I'll do it, but I'm only going to do it if we're going to do it right. And in 2023, the committee raised $13,000 for the entire. In 2022, the committee raised $13,000 for the entire year. In 2023, when I became chairman in March, the committee raised $25,000. And last year in 2024, we raised $50,000. And that is only one measure of success. What that allows us to do is invest in voter outreach. If you're donating, if you contribute to campaigns that raise millions of dollars, if you give $25 or $50 or $100, your campaign contribution is going to pay some consultant. But a committee, we spend almost every dollar that we raise on direct voter contact. And what does that look like? 2 years ago, we mailed sample ballots to 14,000 people in an off year election or an off year election. And then last year we blew out the universe, as we say. I mailed anyone who had ever thought about voting Republican, and we mailed 25,000 households. And Donald Trump, at the top of the ticket, saw a 13 percentage point increase of the vote share in Arlington over 2020. So 2020 to 2024, 13 percentage points more on the turnout side for Republicans. And we actually saw a shift or a swing of about 5 percentage points. So Joe Biden had 81% of the vote in 2020. Kamala Harris got 79% of the vote. So we saw a 2-point decrease. And then on the Republican side, it amounted to a 3-point increase. So do the math, a total of about a 5-point swing. And my goal is, because we have elections every single year, is to engage presidential year voters, people who only vote once every 4 years. I want them to vote every single year, because in 2027, when we have another off year election, when there are actually 11 positions on the ballot in Arlington, we could win a school board race. We could win a county board race. We could win the sheriff's race. We could win a Commonwealth attorney's race. And it's that kind of long-term planning that I'm looking to. And not a lot of committee chairmen do that. A lot of committee chairmen, they serve for 2 years. They rush from one election to the next, and they don't think about the big picture. I have the luxury of, I'm committed to this. Nobody else wants this job, so I'm going to do it. And if somebody wants it, they can run. But nobody else wants to be chairman of the Arlington GOP. And I'm fully invested in building out the infrastructure. And I think part of that is my professional background as someone who trains activists and someone who is in the trenches almost every day. I can then test what we're teaching on the ground in Arlington. And we're seeing those efforts. We're building out, the committee right now is building out subcommittees that we haven't had in 2 decades. And people are coming back. The committee meetings in the mid-2010s felt like you were waiting in a doctor's office. It was very sterile, only business. And now we have, and there was a certain demographic, lovely 70 and 80-year-old people who are important. They're an important part of the committee. But now we have young people in the committee who are taking up leadership positions and taking on responsibilities. And we're building out those efforts. It's almost like reflexing a muscle. If you haven't used your legs in a while, it's going to be hard to use your legs. And so we're spending a couple of cycles reflexing that muscle to build it up and be successful in the future.
Matthew, we talk about living in Northern Virginia, and for people who haven't lived here, they don't really understand how unpopular being conservative is. And I'm not one for victimhood at all. In fact, I'm for the theory of being a victor, not a victim. But I have to say, it's not easy here. And producer Victor, do you have that clip that I want to just show our viewers and our listeners?
When you fucking people tried to overthrow the election, you might as well have been walking up to my head on the way to the polling station, putting a gun to my head, trying to tell me not to vote. You expect me to not take that fucking personally? You fucking try to overthrow elections with violence, and then you're out here among decent people.
Thanks for
coming out. What do you have to
today.
say that, huh? What are your policy prescriptions?
Have a nice day. You've already
fucking
voted.
Rapist rights. Yeah. Involving yourself in people's fucking families and their fucking bedrooms.
It's pretty wild.
You fucking animal. You try to steal my vote next year, I'm gonna fucking remember you personally.
Thank you.
In fact, I'm taking a fucking picture of you. Is that all right?
Yeah, you
Permission?
can. Yeah. It's a one-party consent state.
Shitbird? Yeah, one-party state. You want a fucking one-party country is what you want.
Hey, sir, how are you? Headed in to vote?
Yeah.
Could I get your Republican sample ballot? Sure, thank you.
Try not to be buddy-buddy with these people because they put on the face of a good neighbor. But they support lynch mobs or the fucking KKK. Or they're fucking Bible-beating bigots and freaks. They're not good neighbors.
So Matthew, what was going through your mind when you got approached by this nutcase?
So one of the things that we do in Virginia, and this the first place that I've ever done this, is you pass out sample ballots. So you've got a Republican sample ballot if you're part of the Republican committee, or a Democrat sample ballot if you're a Democrat. And it just provides guidance on all the races. There's significant drop-off from the top of the ballot to the bottom. Some races don't have a partisan affiliation on the ballot, even if they are partisan races. And so we want to make sure that we talk to every voter. And this gentleman, who you see in the video, was very upset. This was in the 2023 election. I was passing out sample ballots at a polling location near Roslyn, and he came up to me shouting. He said that I'd stolen the election, and essentially that I'd put a gun to his head at some point. The really hyperbolic conversation. And he did that on the way in. Now, the great thing about polling locations is there's not a portal on the inside. He has to come back out and go by me again. So I knew at that point he was going to come out. He was going to continue on this tirade that you see in the video. And so I slipped my cell phone into my shirt pocket, and I hit record. And this, actually, the interaction that people see in the video is the second interaction I had with him. And this, I immediately knew the value of this video. I got it up on Twitter or X within minutes. And by the end of the day, I mean, I was on the Jesse Waters program on Fox News that night, and we raised awareness, raised money for the committee. But that is another element of why it is difficult to be a Republican in Arlington and in places like this. Our tolerant neighbors aren't so tolerant. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of my volunteers, a lot of my members are lovely septuagenarian and octogenarian women in their 70s and 80s. And I do not want those nice women interacting with somebody like this. So I proudly go out and pass out sample ballots. We had a lot of younger volunteers in the last couple of elections. And I expressed to my volunteers, if you see something like this, get ready to film. Our proximity to DC means it's very easy to wind up on Fox News or to wind up on some other national outlet. And one of the things that I've done as chairman is, while we stay focused on the local issues, we do try to nationalize our efforts to raise awareness and to raise money for what we're doing. So that is something I don't wish on most of my volunteers, but as an activist, I'm very happy to confront somebody like that. In fact, Patrick, I just saw him at the Trader Joe's a couple of weeks ago, and he did a double take. Now, what happened after that is the video went viral. And I was pursuing a legal avenue. Detectives said that it appeared as though he committed assault, and we wanted to move that through the court system, but ultimately realized our Soros-funded Commonwealth's attorney or prosecutor was not likely to prosecute him. So I dropped the legal pursuit, and he was tried in the court of public opinion. He was a contractor with, I think, HHS. It was no longer employed with that organization, and so there's those kinds of instances, and then there are times where I get very threatening or menacing phone calls, and I shout out to the Arlington County Police. I live just a few blocks away from the police station, and when there are threatening or menacing phone calls, I can make a call, and they step up patrol around where I live, and so this is something that I think I'm bold conservative. I'm an activist, and so I take these slings and arrows. I often tell my members I'm out there out front, taking the punches sometimes, and certainly taking the slings and arrows, because it's important that we're out there. And when we are, voters who aren't like that guy, voters come to us and they say, we didn't know there were Republicans in Arlington. We didn't know we had Republican candidates, and that's why it's so important for us to be everywhere.
That's right. And I got the opportunity last election, where President Trump was reelected, to hand out all day Saturdays the sample ballots. And people probably don't know that the Democrat sample ballot is blue and ours is red. Mm-hmm. So it's like putting a target on us. And I got accosted so many times by people who just couldn't believe I was standing there. Often the analogy that I often hear is it's if I were to take a puppy and kick it in the middle of the square, town square, right? Is by me standing there with a red sample ballot, which just gives people options. I did have a handful of people, but here's the thing, Matthew, and you know this better than anyone. If we don't stand up together, the few conservatives that are here, I think there's a lot more, but many of them are closeted or just afraid to step out because people are not tolerant when it comes to politics here. At
Well,
least the
and
wrong kind of politics, right? They're not tolerant to conservative politics. But I
what we
think by
saw
go ahead.
what we saw last year is because we were so proactive and because the volunteers, the committee were so friendly, we never had a single complaint about one of our volunteers. However, there were several situations where Democrat volunteers were verbally aggressive or they throw up different hand gestures. And because I'm so proactive as a committee chairman, we would get photos of those individuals. We would get statements from people who were not victims, but recipients of the ire of Democrat volunteers. And we had at least 2 Democrat volunteers taken off the front lines during early voting, and they weren't allowed to pass out sample ballots. And so that is something that it isn't only about having a presence there, it's about countering the hateful presence of our neighbors, people that, you might see walking your dog in the neighborhood, or you might see at the grocery store. These are people that we live alongside, and it doesn't make sense to be so nasty to people who are your neighbors. And then to one of your other points, the final Saturday before Election Day, I remember I was coming back out to the Bosman Center where most of the early voting took place, and I looked across the courtyard, and there were 6 Republican sample ballot volunteers, and almost everybody in the courtyard had a red sample ballot in their hand. And that was a moment of pride for me, is going from, no sample ballots 2 or 3 elections prior to this to people were taking them, and we were engaging voters. A few of the volunteers in particular were very proactive about making the case for our Republican principles. And you have to do it everywhere, including a place like Arlington.
Yeah, Arlington, I think is really it's basically an extension of Washington, D.C. when it comes
Mhm.
to politics and even the police having to be extremely careful and not given the kind of latitude they need to really enforce the laws. And they do great work with the limitations that the city and the county put on them. I want to talk to you about going back to our original topic about could you turn the Commonwealth into at least a purple or red? And I did hear rumors, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe we are in the process of trying to get a Scott Pressler like program going or that kind of energy in Virginia and touch those people. And maybe there's enough votes if we could get the people down that are fairly conservative but just don't come out to vote for whatever reason and get them out. Is there something like that in the works, or is that just a dream of us conservatives?
Well, Scott is actually from Fairfax, so
I
he's
know
from just
that.
down the road. So for your listeners and viewers who don't know, Scott Pressler is a hardcore MAGA activist. He spent a lot of time last year in Pennsylvania, switching voter registrations. Now, the difficulty and the nuance between, say, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Virginia is in Pennsylvania, you do register by party. And so when he was going to counties to register, you could get a firm number on how many Republicans he was registering. In the absence of a personality like Scott, and Scott does great work, it is up to the committees and it's up to the state party and it's up to activists in those committees. I haven't heard. I know that, look, Virginia and New Jersey are the only game in town this year. I was just at an event with RNC Chairman Michael Whatley, who committed the full scope of resources from the RNC. Now, does that look like Scott Pressler? Does it look like somebody like Scott Pressler? I don't know, but I know that they are committed to putting the resources into the race, and that could manifest as support for an outside group or support for internal operations. But at the very local level, it's up to the committee. And so, we try to be as many places as we can, and even just within the last 24 hours, my volunteer coordinator, a brand new volunteer to the committee, has said we want to go do different events, farmers markets where the Democrats are to register voters or talk about our candidates. So we're seeing an increased effort. And if every committee did, 10% of what the Arlington GOP is doing, we would see a boost of a few thousand votes in a county and a few thousand votes in a city. And that would be the margin. That would flip us and keep us red for elections to come.
I look at the success President Trump has had with younger voters, and we have our share in Virginia. We've got a lot of colleges here, lots of universities. If you've ever been on the roads through Virginia, you can't go 10 miles without a new university popping up. And it's a fantastic problem to have, right? Because you do have these wonderful things. However, You also have very liberal-minded institutions, and a lot of our college students kind of, I think, go that way. How I wanted to get your kind of take on a kind of a Turning Point USA kind of efforts to coming into Virginia, where just so many people have been just in the Democrat zone for so long.
Many people operate under the assumption that most college students are liberal. Most college students are apathetic. And if engaged by a liberal professor, they will become liberal. If engaged by a Turning Point chapter, they will become conservative. What we found, and what Morton Blackwell, the committeeman from Virginia and the president of Leadership Institute, has found is in a campaign, and I'll provide a very real example in a moment. In a campaign, if you dispatch young campaign staff to college campuses for the specific purpose of organizing college students, you can flip or move the margins. So in 2021, Glenn Youngkin had 8 youth coordinators whose sole responsibility was organizing voters at UVA, Virginia Tech, Liberty, Christendom, George Mason University, all of the colleges across the Commonwealth. And we saw the margin narrow. Here is something that your viewers and listeners may not know. In 2013, when Ken Cuccinelli ran for governor, he was the sitting attorney general, he ran for governor. Ken Cuccinelli actually won outright 18 to 29-year-olds. And that was because there was a specific youth effort. So if there are groups like Turning Point, if there are youth coordinators on campaigns, if there are targeted efforts to engage that demographic, then we can combat the misrepresentation of our principles. We are seeing Donald Trump did a great job, particularly engaging young men who have felt left out of this economy, who felt left out of academia, who felt left out of the culture. And that is something that is going to resonate in future elections if we engage with them. And so there has to be, I know Winsome Sears has a robust intern program, and that intern program will likely generate activity on college campuses. But we have to go out and engage. And it's not just young voters. Donald Trump did well with African Americans. He did well with Hispanics. He did well with Asian voters. All of those populations we have across the Commonwealth. We have a very large Vietnamese and Korean population in Northern Virginia. There are large pockets of Bolivian and Guatemalan and South and Central American voters, Americans who are voters. And if we engage with them on the issues that they care about, by and large, community public safety, strong schools, entrepreneurship, low taxes, then we can bring those voters over to the Republican column and change the outcome of this election. No demographic or no community should be left on the table this election. We should be talking to anybody and everybody who will listen to our principles.
Matt, let's stay on the topic of the youth and give you a chance to explain a little bit what the Leadership Institute is, how long you've been there, and what are kind of the outreach programs that you all have. I've been able to come and be a guest speaker and participate with you guys, but I don't know if our listeners or viewers really know what the Leadership Institute is and how it is helping the conservative movement in Northern Virginia.
Well, Leadership Institute was founded in 1979 by Morton Blackwell, who is a member of my committee, the Arlington GOP. And he got his start in politics as a college Republican at Louisiana State University a long time ago. And he really he got the bug for politics. So he professionalized a training program for college students when he was executive director of the National College Republicans. He took that program, he tested it in Louisiana, and then he tested it in other states. And finally, in 1979, he founded Leadership Institute. Now, he went on to work, he was a youth director, the national director for youth for Reagan in 1980, and went on to work in the Reagan White House. But the Leadership Institute was established in 1979 to identify, recruit, and train conservative activists, to increase the number and effectiveness of those activists. And a large percentage of the people who interact with us the first time are young activists. My first Leadership Institute training, I just run for county commission. My state representative said, "You've got to go to this training." And I went as a college student. And Leadership Institute does a couple of different things for college students. While Leadership Institute doesn't have chapters on campus, we don't have a Leadership Institute at UVA. What we do is work with any conservative student group on those campuses. So you may see Students for Life, Christians United for Israel, Turning Point USA, a Second Amendment group, Young America's Foundation. Leadership Institute will dispatch field representatives or regional field managers to identify conservative students and give them the resources they need to be successful on campus. So that's one aspect of what LI or Leadership Institute does. The other aspect is its flagship 2-day youth leadership school, which is geared toward creating a youth movement or being a youth coordinator for the campaign or the cause of your choice. And it's important to note, Patrick, Leadership Institute is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit. We don't play in elections. We don't endorse candidates. And the people who take our trainings are then tasked with going out and being engaged however they want. You know, there are other organizations like Americans for Prosperity that can train their member activists and then tell them, okay, now go and organize around this issue. Leadership Institute is prevented by the tax code from doing that, so we don't do it. And which is also why we don't work directly with Republican committees or college Republicans. But those resources are made available to students. Many people who take our training, they took their first training when they were in college. And then there are a slew of other trainings as they grow as activists and grow in their careers. If you want to run for office, we've got a training for that. If you want to be a campaign manager, we've got a training for that. If you want to get a job on the Hill or in the State Department, we've got a training for that. But all of those grew out of the flagship Youth Leadership School, which Morton created as a college Republican executive director and then professionalized in 1979. The funny story that Morton likes to tell is, you know, think of these nonprofits in DC: the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, R Street Institute, Americans for Tax Reform. They all deal with policy. Leadership Institute doesn't engage in policy, and for a long time, Morton thought the only people who could run a think tank or a nonprofit were people who smoked a pipe and had leather patches on their elbows. And so for a long time, he didn't create Leadership Institute. And finally, one of his friends said, "You have to create Leadership Institute." So in 1979, he established Leadership Institute, and we have trained more than 350,000 conservative activists across the country and around the world. And undoubtedly, those activists have gone on to win elections. They've gone on to help their candidates win elections. They've gone on to work in the White House and work in state capitals across the country. And they are making a positive impact for conservative public policy in this country.
Well, thank you, Matthew. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here with your energy and your experience. I don't know another guest that knows facts like you do. You obviously live this. You're a true conservative. You believe in giving Virginians other options, and when it comes to who they're going to elect and what policies they're going to adopt. Thank you for your work with the Arlington Republican Committee, and also we hope to have you back on as we get closer to election time, to have you come back on the show and give us updates and let our listeners and viewers know how they can help if they do live in the Virginia area. They can join me out there with some sample ballots and maybe some hockey equipment, maybe a helmet or some shoulder pads or something, just to keep the people away. But thank you again, Matthew. We look forward to having you again soon.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for all the work that you guys do. This is an important conversation, and you've had many important conversations with many guests, and I look forward to a future opportunity to rejoin you.
Thanks so much.
In a world full of noise, clarity is power. Stay informed, stay aware, stay top of mind.